Almost 2 weeks after the budget statement and proposals delivered by Prime Minister and Minister of Finance, the Honourable Mia Amor Motley, there has been much debate and discussion surrounding several of the measures. One proposal creating a lot of discussion has been that of pension reform. On this one-on-one, we seek to bring greater clarity and further dissect some critical proposals with a key member of the government's economic team. A very good evening to you. I'm Lisa Lord. My special guest is the Minister in the Ministry of Finance and Economic Affairs, the Honourable Ryan Straughn. Minister, thank you so much for joining us.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much.
Now, I would have interviewed Minister Colin Jordan, who has responsibility for Social Security and therefore the National Insurance Scheme last week. But as I understand it, you are the person responsible for spearheading pension reform on the island. The concern, however, for many was the announcement that new public servants will now have to work 40 years in order to attain their maximum pension versus the customary 33 and a third. Explain this move.
Well, thanks very much for the question. One of the challenges that we've been faced with over the course of the last few years is really how do we finance public sector pensions. Now, we have looked at the demographics, certainly not just of the public service, but certainly the demographics in the country, to the extent that the funding for public sector pensions come directly from revenue. Certainly the last 2 years certainly have been quite a bit of a challenge, obviously because of COVID. But that notwithstanding, the mechanism through which we determine how pensions are assessed, given the trajectory with respect to issues related to early retirement. As you know, there was a time when people used to retire at 55. That is no longer the case. And therefore, when those reforms were ushered in the past, most persons would have retired at 55 years old. And therefore, the normal age with respect to the number of years that you would have put into the service, accruing, as we would say, would have been 33 and a third, which is that magic number. But that 33 and a third meant that in theory, 2% of your accrued pension would have been built up over those 33 and a third years to get you to the 2/3 of your final salary with respect to where you were. As you know, just about 20 years ago, 2003, 19 years, there was some pension reform ushered in at the time. And the retirement age was moved then from 65 to 67. And within the context, the early retirement age for the public service moved from 55 to 60. So for the average person for whom they would come into the service today, and just to be clear, does not affect anybody who is already in the service and obviously clearly pensionable. But going forward, with respect to the rate at which we need to see enhancement of the demographics in the total population. Two, to make the pensions more sustainable in terms of being payments, that the determination with respect to when you'll be eligible for a full pension relates to the fact that, one, if you have a 20-year-old coming into the service tomorrow, 21 years old even, then by the time they get to 60, they would already have worked the 40 years with respect to being able to accrue their pension. Now, what we've also said is that going forward, persons will have the opportunity to be able to help finance their pension. And pension planning, I must say, is one of those things that are absolutely, is one of the most important things that public servants should be aware of, but equally the wider community in Barbados with respect to planning for their retirement. So the 40 years, shifting from 33 and a third to 40, simply just reflects the fact that the early retirement in reality has shifted from 55 to 60. Now, I don't know whether contemplated going forward that may shift to another age. There was some recommendation with respect to moving it to 62. But we believe that in so doing, it means that the accrual rate, which will now reduce from 2% per year to 1.67, would mean then that over the course of that period of time, that public servants would be able to accrue their pensions or contribute to those pensions and make the system much more resilient. Now, what is equally important, I think, is the fact that with those pension reforms in 2003, it meant that pensions are now portable. So you can move from one employer to the other. So there are a number of other reforms that we are bringing into being that will not disadvantage public servants. So for example, if you move from central government to state-owned enterprise and back, or even to the private sector and back, we are cleaning that up so that your service is your service. And therefore, it isn't just the fact that you're extending what you're eligible in terms of accruing your full pension, but literally going through all of the issues that tend to humbug public servants with respect to eligibility is where we're going through to make sure that we work out those fine details so that irrespective of where you serve and how long you serve, that you're not disadvantaged with respect to the service that you're given to the public. And therefore, we're intending to resolve all of that within the context of this set of pension reforms so that as people give public service, that we're able to make sure that that is regularized as far as possible. There's been long-standing issues with respect to people being reverted to posts for which they're appointed, having served in a higher capacity. That disadvantages the public servant. And therefore, within the context of these reforms, we're intended to resolve those matters so that persons can serve, whether you're appointed to a position or not, and have that time with respect to being able to qualify for your pension. And therefore, it is important that we understand that whilst the new provisions don't affect existing public servants, they too will have an opportunity to contribute if they want to, because we believe that planning for your pension is absolutely important, and therefore allow us to be in a position to bring greater sustainability with respect to the public finances as it relates to the provision of pension services for public servants. So it isn't only about moving from 33 and a third to 40. There's a suite of other administrative humbugs which we are seeking to resolve. And we know that particularly coming out of COVID, we have to look at how we work, the utilization of greater technology. It simply takes too long right now for persons when they retire. The process just takes too long to be resolved with respect to pensions, which is why we have indicated that in order to make sure that we get this right, that we will vest the responsibility in the National Insurance Scheme to be able to administer pensions for the public service so that you avoid all of the back and forth between the Treasury, the Auditor General, public service, and you have a system that is clean, where the records are clean. So obviously the stakeholders will have an opportunity every year to make sure that persons, as they approach their retirement, are given the information. They can check that the information that is on their record is up to date and accurate, so that when you do decide to put in your application for retirement, that your information is as up to date as it possibly could be, so that we can shorten the length of time with respect to resolution as it relates to those matters. But there are a suite of reforms, and we are hoping that obviously we can get everything in place smoothly. Pension administration is not a straightforward matter because you have to get the calculations right. And this is not to say that those stakeholders are not going to have a part in the process, but the National Insurance Scheme is the largest pension payer in the country. They certainly manage the largest set of assets in the country, and therefore we're given the responsibility to be able to manage that so that the other administrative matters can be taken care of by the specific departments, but that we can get this right and that Barbadians can feel a sense of security that they can live out their golden years in peace.
Speaking of calculations, the contribution ceilings have also been altered as well.
Yes. So, as you know, coming out of the reforms in 2003, there is the insurable ceiling, which goes up every year. I think the last 2 years, they were frozen at $4,880 per month as the insurable ceiling. And therefore, starting January 1st of 2023, you will start to see over the course of the next 15 years or so, those insurable ceilings go up. Now, what does this mean? Is that basically to sustain the pension system, and as incomes, we anticipate obviously incomes will rise, and therefore as incomes rise, as the economy grows, then obviously the level of contribution and the cost of living, as persons have indicated, obviously will rise, and therefore planning for your pension for the future will mean then obviously that you need to make sure that you can have those incremental increases in contributions, which over time, the investment strategy certainly of the national insurance scheme, as well as other pension funds across the country, but certainly as it relates to the insurance scheme, you will see then the returns on those investments increasing, and therefore being able to pay a pension, which should be able to help ensure then that persons in their retirement can actually live reasonably comfortably.
Another announcement made by Ms. Motley was that it was her intention to make the NIS more independent from the government by making it a statutory corporation by the end of this year. What does that entail? And what does that mean for NIS?
Well, as it stands at the moment, it is a department of government. Yes, it does have a board, but because it is a department of government, it means that it is subject to, by way of recruitment of staff, it is still subject to the public service orders by way of rotation and these types of things that may come up from time to time. I think as we look at it today, and as I said earlier, it is the largest fund in Barbados, and therefore we have to treat it as such. This is the nation's social security. And therefore, we believe that by setting it apart from government in terms of the administration, whilst we will still have insight in terms of the investment strategy, with respect to it, its day-to-day operations really should not be subject to the regular department of the public service. And therefore we are moving to make sure that they can do that, which means that they can recruit the appropriate staffing with the appropriate skill set to be able to give Barbadians the confidence that the fund is being managed obviously in the way that we would all like it to be. And therefore, part and parcel of that means then that administratively, we're going to need to separate it, in a sense, from government, appoint an appropriate governing body, which obviously, given that it is the largest set of individual funds that we have in the country, that we get the boards right, we get the management right, we get the staffing right, in order to make sure then that all of us who contribute into the national insurance scheme will feel confident, obviously, with respect to being able to ensure that it is being run appropriately. One of the things that we've had to do certainly in the last few years is to clear a whole backlog of financial statements for all of the funds that it manages. And we've made some significant progress, but the truth is that should never ever have occurred. And the extent to which we hold the fund accountable is important, because obviously to whom much is given, much is expected, and therefore, given the emphasis on encouraging people to plan for their retirement, and financial literacy certainly is one of those things that the government has rolled out in a very serious way to help Barbadians understand a little better all of what is taking place within the environment that we're operating in. The National Insurance Scheme, National Insurance Fund, obviously is a part of that, and therefore we must hold them to account. And obviously, I want to say at this particular point as well, as we are on this subject, that we always encourage persons to, whether self-employed or businesses or even as employees, that you must check to ensure that your contributions are made. If you're self-employed, you should make your contributions, because as COVID has demonstrated, anything can happen at any point in time. And therefore, the government / the fund must be in a position from a policy perspective to make decisions about how people can survive in this country. And therefore, I want to encourage all Barbadians to make their contributions to the National Insurance Scheme, because it literally is the lifeline. of the nation. And therefore, in order to ensure that we can provide as much social stability as we can for as little as $21 a week, whether you're a coconut vendor, whether you're a barber, whether you're a hairdresser, or a mason, carpenter, whatever, lawyer, doctor, whatever it is, for as little as $21 a week, you can be assured a pension in this country. But we encourage people to make sure that the contributions are made. The portal is available for them to be able to check. I check to make sure. And therefore, I encourage all Barbadians to be able to check their records, because planning for retirement means that you don't wait till you get to 67, only then to realize, oh shoot, my employer didn't make those contributions as I thought they were being made. Or as a self-employed person, I really should have. And in order to avoid that kind of disappointment, I encourage very, very, very strongly Barbadians to contribute to the National Insurance Fund.
The Prime Minister and Minister of Finance has again signaled her intention to go looking at the state-owned enterprises, most notably among them the National Housing Corporation, the Barbados Agricultural Management Company, the Caribbean Broadcasting Corporation, and several others being up for review, hopefully before the end of the year. But whenever someone hears about restructuring, automatically they think job losses.
Okay, so those state-owned enterprises were part of the phase 3. So we had initially had
and this is under BERT.
Under BERT, our Barbados Economic Recovery and Transformation Program. So we had phase 1 was to the end of January 2019. Phase 2, because BERT started October 1st, 2018. So phase 1 reforms were intended for March of 2019. March of 2019. Phase 2, March of 2020. And then phase 3 obviously would have been 2020 to 2021 in order to complete the reform process. So as we were about to go into moving towards a number of these other SOEs, obviously COVID hit and that was forestalled. Now, let's say by way of example, let me give you a clear example with respect to the agricultural sector as an example. So we have BAMC sitting on large tracts of land as an example, and probably less than a third of the lands, as we estimated, are actually in production. So we are supporting enterprises, and you will notice that over the course of the last few years, we've actually tried to put in infrastructure to support agriculture. So whilst the reforms have started and not yet been concluded, the reality is that the reforms within agriculture is really about how do we transition agriculture from what we know it as to an industry that is actually not just supporting the economy in terms of domestically, but being able to drive opportunities for young people, but also to export and help grow the economy. So rather than pay lip service to agriculture and everybody says, oh, agriculture, the reforms in agriculture are actually intended to deliver growth for the economy, because it is a productive sector. So you will see some rationalization within there in the context of whether it is BACT, the Barbados Agricultural Credit Trust, BADMC, Barbados Agricultural Development Marketing Corporation, or the Barbados Agricultural Marketing Management Company. 3 different entities, 3 different sets of finances, financials, accounting sections, HR sections, a whole set of things. But you're not seeing the kind of production that we want to be able to see in order to lift the output of the economy. So those reforms are intended to be productive reforms. So what do we need to do strategically to bring those 2/3 of the lands back into production? And therefore, the extent to which, for example, we support sugar in the way that it was done in the past, those are reforms that also have to be undertaken, because we have been putting a lot of money into an industry called sugar that really the returns on that investment is no longer there.
Right.
And therefore, rationalizing what we do within that space, very clear and conscious that there are other aspects of agriculture that need support, there are other aspects of the economy that need support, and therefore those are some of the things that we're ensuring then that we can deliver in the short term so that we can transition agriculture away from being a pariah, so to speak, in society. I know there's some long-standing issues relating to pre-day larceny and those types of things. Within that space, we're also going to see, for example, passage of the sanitary and phytosanitary legislation, which fundamentally will change things for ordinary people in the country, particularly poultry producers, as well as the fisher folk, in terms of being able to export. And therefore, the reforms within that space, I believe, will be significant, certainly in the short term. And if you are involved in agriculture, you really shouldn't fear, in the context that if you can produce, the point of being in agriculture is to produce.
Right.
And therefore, whether it is by way of new investment opportunity, unlocking of lands, the provision of water, all of these are things that are being done now to reposition the agricultural sector for growth going forward. So if you happen to be an employee of any of these state-owned enterprises, I would say that this is a wonderful opportunity, as we have been putting in the water infrastructure as well as getting lands back into production. This is a wonderful opportunity to participate in revitalization of an industry that has long been asking for this kind of attention, and therefore see it as an opportunity to pivot and determine that, one, rather than being an employee of a state-owned enterprise, that you can get access to land, access to water, access to investment to actually produce. And therefore, rather than relying on a salary when the month comes, in the way that you're actually being in a productive space with a clear view for export, which means then that you can become independently wealthy if you apply the knowledge and the years of experience that you already have within that specific sector. And therefore, I really see it as an opportunity to move away from what we perhaps have grown to be comfortable with, but it's something that persons will have to reorient their minds towards.
Well, Minister Straughn, you said all of that, but you still didn't touch on whether job losses would be coming.
All right. So, as I said earlier, it depends on the perspective of the person within the context, and I use the agriculture as a classic example. So, we're making lands available, we're making water available, financing in place, as well as for equipment, and therefore, the process through which we go through now to move people from employees to owners, that enfranchisement process is really what agriculture is right for. In the same way that, for example, if you're a media practitioner, the world now has moved to a stage where, for example, if you happen to work at CBC, for example, the production of content in a global environment is a space that I would like to believe that if I was one involved in the media, that I would grab the opportunity to be able to produce the content and earn a living. Now, I say that conscious that people are always a little weary about moving to something new, but recognizing that technology is allowing the world to be much more democratized by way of access. I think if you're a professional in a space and you back yourself and you have the confidence, then you should be coming to the government and say to the government, this is what we want to do, because we recognize that there is space for opportunity, that the individual now can go to hire people to work for you in order to be able to produce what you need to produce. And that's why I said, when we look at the resources that are available and how we are deploying them, obviously, for whatever reason, the motivation has not been there from given the recent experience. And therefore, I don't, and I say this in all sincerity, I think there are real opportunities here for people. And I think given what this government has put on the table with respect to access to finance, access to lands, the water resources that we're putting in those spaces, and even as it relates to media and any other space that we have, the world in 2022, notwithstanding the uncertainty that COVID has created, and certainly with this war now, the world today is very different from when it was 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And therefore, Barbadians, I encourage them, if you work in any of these state-owned enterprises, see this as an opportunity for you to be able to own a stake in something. and to be able to build the kind of enterprise that can be global. And therefore, to the extent to which, for example, we have done some work in Guyana and Suriname to again expand the agriculture reach. That I think that will bear fruit certainly in the next 2 to 3 years going forward. Within the context of media, the media landscape is forever changing, and therefore, yes, I know that people will crave that notion of stability, but stability. What the notion of stability in this very dynamic world is exactly what will work against your interests in the long run. And I think you have to back your professionalism to be able to go out there, create the content, produce within the context of the agricultural space, utilizing all of the technologies that are available to us, and get out to the world. And the government of Barbados is in a position to help facilitate that. And I will say to persons, do not fear that. I know that that's what will come to mind immediately, but there are opportunities. Seize the opportunity is what carpe diem is the phrase. You got to seize it there.
Well, still a lot more to unpack, Minister, but we'll seize the opportunity now to take a break. We'll be back with more one-on-one. Stay with us.
I am Lloyd Gollum, artificial inseminator attached to the Pig Improvement Program in the Ministry of Agriculture. There is a deadly disease lurking on our doorstep. The African swine fever, the ASF, has been detected in the Dominican Republic. This disease is deadly. If that disease strikes, all your pigs can die. For those farmers who usually utilize the traveling boar, both the farmer who receives the traveling boar service and the farmer who operates the traveling boar service must keep their premises clean, disinfect regularly, bathe that animal, keep that boar in a separate pen, if possible downwind from the rest of the herd. When operating the service, take along with you a basin, your brush, and your soap so that you can disinfect before and after. There is a safer alternative. The Pig Improvement Program offers insemination to the general public. And you can get more information about this by simply calling the Ministry of Agriculture 535-5958, 5957, or 5956. When feeding or dealing with your animals, have a set of clothes that is worn only for that purpose. If you're going from your farm to somewhere else, remove those clothes and wash them regularly. Do not feed swill. Swill is all the scraps and pieces of potato peeling that is left over after you prepare your dinner. If that swill contains infected meat, it can bring that disease onto your farm. We have to be very careful. For this disease, there is no cure, there is no vaccine, there is no treatment.
Help us keep African swine fever out of Barbados.
Welcome back, Minister. We're still dissecting the recent budget. One of the measures that got a lot of criticism is the pandemic contribution levy and the pandemic contribution tax. Explain who the levy and the tax targets and how it will be applied.
Well, it is one levy, obviously in broken into two parts. When we reviewed based on principle, when we review the performance of the economy, certainly over the last 2 years, so we're talking about 2020 and 2021, given that the government, in the context of having to introduce a number of measures for social protection, and by that, we're talking about the household mitigation, the ramping up of the household mitigation efforts with the Adopt a Family program. We also increased the welfare vote to be able to help extend more benefits to Barbadians. And we did a number of other temporary job programs, as you can see, to help families get through that particular period of time. In the context of having to spend more on COVID with a reduced revenue, we had to borrow to be able to finance that. And therefore, the extent to which we look at businesses as well as individuals who throughout the pandemic were able either to work from home or really experience very little by way of disruption. When we looked at the profitability and we looked at that on the basis of that, we said, in order for us to get through this year given that even though the economy is open, but is not fully back to the kind of momentum that we knew certainly in 2019, we recognize that in order to be able to bridge the gap and to bank on that growth, that we needed to have the pandemic contribution levy. Now, just let me make it clear: you can only have a pandemic contribution levy on the basis of the period of the pandemic, and therefore there has been some those for whom the levy applies, certainly on the commercial side, believe that the tax is retroactive. You can only have a pandemic levy on the basis of what transpired during the pandemic. Now, when we looked at it, those sectors, whether they're banks, insurance companies, telecoms, as well as oil and gas, effectively during the course of the 2 years made significantly more profits than other parts of the sector, and we were perhaps the least disruptive because they were able to shift a lot of their stuff online to for the most part. Okay, and therefore we felt that it was important that to send a signal that in the context of us being able to contribute, that we will be able to raise some monies from that as a one-off, specific to the period of the pandemic as we have defined it, in order to make sure we get through this particular period of time. As it relates to persons, to individuals, we look through the profile again of taxpayers, and we determined that 1% of the gross salary over $75,000 a year is appropriate to help finance, and that obviously will be applied over the course of the next 12 months starting in April 2022. So we looked at it in terms of the balance, because the options available to us in terms of how we were going to finance this without doing any significant harm to the tax structure permanently or otherwise, that we felt that was the best option to be able to raise the required financing in order to ensure that we can get through the coming fiscal year. Some may feel as if they've been targeted.
Yes, many are calling it unfair.
But in our estimation, the capacity to contribute was, yes, a definition that we had to apply, obviously, to ensure that those who can contribute, that they would, on the basis of which we ascertain that they can. It is not, if the government did not need to raise the revenue in this way, we would not have. And there were many calls. People said you should increase the taxes, roll back the 2019 or 2020 taxes that had gone in, where we had lowered from 32.5 down to 28.5. People said all kinds of things, but we felt the cleanest way was to be able to go this particular route as a clear signal that this was not an income tax measure, because we believe that with growth coming back certainly in the next financial year, that the current tax structure as it relates to income taxes, we believe are fair. As a matter of fact, Barbadians are paying the least amount of income tax today than they were from when we were coming into office and before. And therefore, as we transition the economy now to focus more on transactional taxes, we believe then that with the economy recovering, that their revenues will be able to cover what we need to cover by way of expenditure. But because we're only now really truly, the curfew's only been removed, I think about a month.
Yeah,
about a month. So we are literally going into the next fiscal year, April 1st, fully open, and I hope that can be the case for the remainder of our term, not just the next fiscal year, but for the remainder of our term. No disruption. I hope literally no ash, no storms, no nothing, so that we can have a normal year of economic activity, that households can start to feel at ease again, because there's still a lot of persons who their bills and the rents and the mortgages, and there's still some anxiety there. A number of small businesses are still feeling it, and therefore we need some sustained momentum in order for persons to be able to feel a little easier with respect to their financial situation. So that's what we are focusing on, growth. And therefore, we believe then that coming April 1st, with the pandemic contribution levy in place, that we'll be able to finance early on with respect to our fiscal situation, so that we can execute without compromising some of the other services that we've put in place to bring people through. And we hope that certainly over the next fiscal year, that certainly the COVID programs and a number of those things that were put in place can be transitioned back to the private sector, and therefore allow us then to go back on the path of where we started with the original BERT program.
One of the easiest Barbadians got during the budget was a reduction on the VAT on diesel and gas. However, that will cost the government $25 million in terms of loss of revenue. How do we make up a shortfall like that?
Well, just to be clear, so when we program, prior to coming into this financial year, we programmed in 75 US revenues on $75 US a barrel, right? In terms of fuel prices and what have you. Of course, the escalation of the war and prices going up carry the prices up. So the $25 million, having capped the VAT, is revenue foregone, yes, but based on our initial estimates, we are not losing revenue, and therefore,
because it was a projection.
It was a projection that if prices were $75 a barrel, we will get X amount in revenue. It is over $75 a barrel, so therefore we can cap what the revenues that we have there. Now, I just want to make it clear to the public, if prices continue to go up, the fact that we have capped the revenue does not mean that the cost will not be passed on. And therefore, we try to shield people as much as we can whilst protecting not necessarily protecting the revenue, but it's really about the revenue to provide the public services that people want. And therefore, to that extent, we are mindful that there's a dynamic with respect to the cost of living. Certainly, we hope that the supply of containers will moderate, because after the Ever Given was in the Suez Canal last year, we're still feeling the effects of that even now. And I hope that as things normalize, that those costs will come down. I'm hoping that commodity prices will also come down. But of course, I believe 30% of the world's grain or wheat is supplied by Ukraine. And therefore that is going to be an issue globally. Russia also supplies 10% or so about of the world oil. So these things are not to be scoffed at, and therefore we've put some measures in place in certainly for the next 2 years to encourage people to transition to certainly the electrification of the fleet of the cars. There can be no clearer incentive than the moment that we're living in to be able to make that transition. So it is a situation where we are monitoring it very, very, very carefully, and we hope that things can normalize quickly so that prices can come back down and that we can get things back to normal. But let me say this. I see a lot of stuff circulating about prices in Barbados compared to other places. And it's important for the public to recognize that the suite of public goods and services that the government of Barbados provides, is really second to none. And therefore, the extent to which a price that you see quoted for gasoline or diesel compared to others in the region is not a reflection of what the average citizen can go either to a school, a polyclinic, or any of the other services that we provide in the country and access easily and free at the point of delivery. And therefore, which also includes education from nursery all the way to tertiary. So therefore, we must understand that when you see something quoted on social media, it often does not say that this is what you get in with respect to that in Barbados, vis-a-vis what you may get or may not get in the other parts of the world that the prices are being quoted, are being compared to.
Moving back to a point you made about the move to electric vehicles, we know that there will be an excise and VAT holiday on electric vehicles for 2 years starting April 1st. What has the feedback been like to that plan?
Well, the feedback has been very positive. A number of persons also want to know whether it includes hybrids. Now, the truth is that we've given a commitment to move away from these fossil fuels by 2030. It's a very aggressive thing, and therefore we want to be able to achieve that. Now, I will remind the public that last year, April 1st, 2021, came into effect where government's vehicles to be replaced will be electric vehicles. So the government itself is starting to change out its own vehicular fleet. You've seen the transport board electrified. We're sorry that sanitation trucks weren't available in electric at the time. Otherwise, we would have bought electric trucks at the time. But I'm sure that at some point, those will come into being. And therefore, the government itself is committed to ensuring then that it can deliver on its own with respect to that. We've increased the lending limit to public servants for electric vehicles to 100,000 to be able to procure that. And this should demonstrate to people that we're very serious about this matter. And therefore, whilst the call with respect to hybrids has been there, at this particular point in time, we're not considering that. We want to go all the way. And therefore, if we're going to be able to benefit from, we've been advocating globally for the need for us to change how we are doing things. I'm saying to Barbadians, let us come on board with respect to doing this. The halfway measures kind of only take us so far because it still will rely on the fossil fuel. And therefore, if the strategy is to become less reliant on fossil fuel, then we have to go all in as far as we can go. I accept that there may be some supply issues in the short term, but so long as there's demand, there will always be supply. And I say to Barbadians that over the course of the next 2 years, to work as hard as possible to see, if you don't have to change out your vehicle, then I'm not telling you to go and change your vehicle because we put an incentive out there. But if you can, go right ahead. And I would encourage all Barbadians to look at their circumstance and determine for themselves whether they are interested.
Why is it important for the government to look at drafting legislation to introduce these reverse mortgages?
So this is a matter, and I must apologize. I apologize to Bart formally because it's a matter that they've brought to my attention since I came into office. But with all the reforms and everything that was taking place, I simply didn't have the time to do. And I regret that. I genuinely do, because the reverse mortgage, and as you know, we've seen all across Barbados homes that are, built probably in the late 70s, early 80s, elderly persons living in them, and they're not well maintained. And the extent to which planning for pension, actually, incidentally, a lot of our grandparents bought land, built homes, right? And it's part of unlocking access to that investment, that capital, if you like, so that our grandparents can live a little more comfortably in their golden years. And that's the one thing I would say I regret not executing in the previous term. But I give them my commitment that I will get it done before the end of this year, because it is part of building resilience within families. And I know that there are lots of persons who may feel a little concerned, but here's the thing about it. I know socially, too often we see properties around the place, nobody's living in them. They run to ruin, they get derelict. And again, these are our parents, our grandparents who work hard, and we as brother and sister can't agree what to do with the house. And it's a problem because we need to be able to maintain these assets, these houses in production in order to be able to pass from one generation to the next. So the reverse mortgage will allow for that elderly couple or elderly person who's still living in their home to be able to extract some equity from that they've built up into the property, to be able to help them to live a much more comfortable lifestyle in their old age, repair the property, get it back into a decent shape, which will help to spur on some further economic activity. But I think it is really to make sure that persons have available to them, should they need it, access to finances at the time, because obviously you're retired, you're no longer working, you can have access to finances, whether it's for health purposes or otherwise, to make sure that as you're living out your golden years, that they're as comfortable as possible.
So you can take a breather. We're going to move away from the budget now and focus a little bit on your ministry. Tell me about some of the key projects and initiatives happening in your ministry.
Well, the Ministry of Finance has never stopped working from day one. We've done quite a bit of reforms within customs, some reforms within the Revenue Authority. We're even doing procurement as well. Later this year, we did the procurement bill at the end of December. We'll be rolling out a new procurement system, which will be an online system. For persons will be encouraged to register as suppliers. They will get all the tender information as it relates to government. We are streamlining the tendering process to shorten and make sure that we can execute as quickly as possible. And I'll be happy to do a very specific thing on that, because I think that will help transform and deliver on the enfranchisement opportunities that we've put in for young people, persons with disabilities, and the like, with respect to that space. We have been working with the financial institutions through the central bank to develop this national payments ecosystem. The National Payment Systems Bill was passed last January 2021, but the testing and stuff is still ongoing. Right now, we only have two banks, two commercial banks and the central bank are live with respect to the real-time ACH. So it means that I can take up my phone and send to you, and the money will come literally within moments. And I've said to them from the very beginning, I want to be able to go to my coconut vendor on Sunday and pay for my coconut water, and I know then that we will be in a good place. So right now, the remaining banks, credit unions are testing. That testing should be completed by the end of August, so that by October 1st, we should have all of the payment service providers online with respect to that. There are a number of persons who are developing mobile apps to pay and those types of things. So all of that will be in the space with respect to allowing people to pay. Why is this important? For however many years now, we've been hearing people talk about businesses not having access to credit. So if you're a small business, you have your choice of a payment service provider, which is in the past were mainly banks, but you have your choice of a payment service provider. But the beauty about it is that all your transactions then, or most of your transactions now will be digital, which means that your record keeping, as we would say, is now in a better shape, so that at the end of the month, it's even better than that. Depending on where you are in the financial space, if you're digital, it means that you can have monies linked to you as required. So there are instances where, for example, you may require some credit to purchase some stock in the morning. You sell them and you can pay back in the afternoon based on your cash flow needs. So you can get as precise as that. But the problem we're trying to solve is dealing with the data and the so-called lack of record keeping, which has been a hindrance to all businesses. So I encourage all businesses that once this system is rolled out to avail themselves of it, because it means that you can go to any financial institution and access credit, which is why when we did the Fair Credit Reporting Bill and the credit scoring and those types of things that would be in place, that you can actually unlock access to credit so that your risk profile is diminished because there's information. And therefore, once you're getting the cash flowing through your business on a day-to-day basis, it's digital, it's easy to collate, easy to present, and therefore then you have access to credit, and then we start to see other opportunities for growth. But the other flip side of that is we spend too much time standing by lines to pay. And I know government is one of the chief. We've been working with Easy Pay and Miss to bring through all of the matters that relate to payments in government. And whether it's licensing or BRA or these types of things, and this is where our communication now with the public has to be critical, because we are putting these systems in place, but people are still doing the thing that they're accustomed to doing. So I want to know that I went to Lisa. Lisa's the cashier. I gave her the check and I want the receipt. There's a cultural shift that we now need to bring about to have the efficiencies. So we're working on that. It's not quite yet finished, but we hope that by the end of this next fiscal year, that we should have all of government's revenues online. The back office arrangements then have to change within our government offices, but equally in the private sector, there are other places that they haven't changed their back office operations as yet as well. So as the payment system comes online, it means that we have to change the way that we're reconciling in the back office to make sure that the customer is well served.
There is something I want you to touch on briefly, because you mentioned customs. People are still complaining about the duties on items that they bring into the country, the high duties.
Right. So we are bringing a new customs tariff, right? And just to be clear, and this is something that I gave a commitment that it will do before the election, and it will do it in April, because I will do a town hall with the Controller of Customs and some of his staff to explain this whole thing. Yeah, because this thing is not a mystery, it is not a mystery. So clothing, I use clothing because I know people haven't traveled in a little while, and they will order some clothing on the internet. Now, there's something called the Common External Tariff, right? Common External Tariff. And in a sense, it is linked to what we as CARICOM countries agree, that anything that's coming from outside CARICOM has to be bound by these tariffs. So if you buy a shirt or a dress from Trinidad, right, there's a specific tariff, or depending on what it is, it may even be duty free, right? If you buy a shirt from England, Turkey, United States, and there's not a reciprocal agreement with respect to the countries, then you pay a different thing over and above what we agree as CARICOM. So the customs tariff is not a mystery. It depends on where the product comes from and the appropriate tariff that applies to that. So at the appropriate time, as I said, in April, I will go through all of that with the Controller of Customs and everybody at the town hall very clearly, because if you see something on the internet, when it gets here and it says it is made in X place, then the customs can only apply the tariff from the origin for which the country, from where the good comes. So there's no mystery to this thing. Clothing, as you know, we used to have a fairly vibrant garment industry. We are hoping to be able to revive that garment industry to produce some high-valued products, working with our local designers to be able to do that, get the financing in place so you can get their products out to market. We are working on that at the moment, and BIDC/Export Barbados is spearheading some of those efforts to be able to rebuild an industry around garments. Now, I can't say to you that we will ever have that kind of mass production that we had in the 80s. I would love it to, but I'm not sure that we will get back there. But there is still a protectionist mechanism in the region, because Trinidad has the capacity to manufacture. And therefore, as part of CARICOM, which, as I hope the listeners are aware, Barbados spearheads the CSME in CARICOM. And therefore, being the spearhead of CSME and CARICOM, we have to set the example with respect to respecting the origin of goods, applying the appropriate tariff to those goods to ensure that we are protecting ourselves as a region in the process. I know that the pandemic has meant that persons have had to do a lot of shopping online, and incidentally paying a lot more to bring the stuff here than it actually costs.
The items cost, correct.
And that is a very interesting indeed. But the Customs Department is simply, as it does every day at the Bridgetown Port or the airport with respect to collecting revenue, it's just simply applying the tariff that has been agreed within the context of CARICOM. There is very little discretion, and that's why ASICUDA was implemented in 2019, so that the appropriate classification is done for each item to ensure that government is collecting revenue, and that there's nothing untoward between importers and customs officers.
Minister Straughn, thank you so much for talking to us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
You're most welcome. That was the Minister in the Ministry of Finance and Economic Affairs, the Honorable Ryan Straughn. I am Lisa Lord. Thank you so much for joining. Good evening.